Well, good afternoon, film fanatics. It is, when you see this actually anyway, it's going to be Casual Friday. So um, I've got a corduroy coat on, but I'm kind of resurrecting my high school nickname in the form of my Flash superhero T-shirt. So hope you can allow for that, given that it's later in the week and, online phone stuff. I'm not going to be in my bow tie or anything today or probably for the foreseeable future. So this is part two of the 1980s Zoom lectures, and I wanted to walk us through a few more films, particularly a few more directors. And I've already gotten a bunch of your 1980s reviews, and I've read them and graded them, and I think I have a few more left to do, but I've actually done most of them. So some really good films that you guys watched, and actually some of the films that I already covered in the previous Zoom lecture. We're actually going to start today with a director named James Cameron, who has certainly made a name for himself in the last 25 years or more. And it's interesting, the kinds of films that he's typically associated with are, the sci-fi, fantasy genre of some sort, and he's a very creative director in that particular genre. He has branched out a few times, probably most famously with his historical drama Titanic, starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, etc. But his breakthrough film came in 1984, famously with Arnold Schwarzenegger in The Terminator. And it's a fascinating set piece that has actually obviously birthed this Terminator franchise that continues into the present era. Many of the other films that were made after the first one are not as good. The second one is actually very well done too. But the first one is obviously as far as the innovator, as far as the film that kind of gets things off the ground for James Cameron's career. It's the most important of them. So the film, of course, stars Schwarzenegger, who is still kind of ironing through the English language, to say the least, at that point. Very intelligent, very capable man, actually, but he still had that thick Austrian accent. I'm the Terminator, right? He still had that thick Austrian accent with him at that point in his career. It's still there, of course, even in 2020, but it has certainly dissipated over time. It actually fit the character very well, and his robotic performance, as you can imagine, really made a whole lot of sense, given the fact that he was playing this cyborg machine that is sent back through time to terminate this woman named Sarah Connor. And as a post-apocalyptic kind of sci-fi thriller, it kind of broke new ground. It wasn't reinventing the wheel necessarily, but it did use some interesting new set pieces. And the interesting thing is, when you look at the film, one of the first things you'll probably notice is that there are some definite limitations with the special effects technology that was integrated into the film. James Cameron did not have the budget that he was given in later films. It was still kind of a proving ground kind of a film for him. So there are some pretty cheesy special effects, especially near the end of the film when the Terminator has all of his skin and hair burned off, and it's just this metal skeleton thing that's walking around. It doesn't really look all that convincing compared to what we see now. But I do think that the whole concept of the film was one that set it apart. A lot of audiences flocked to see the film. Many of them had little or no awareness of Arnold Schwarzenegger to that point. He'd been in a couple of films like Conan the Barbarian prior to this, but he certainly had not really made a huge dent in the Hollywood Western film industry. And his co-stars in the film, the gentleman who plays the Reese character, his name is Michael Biehn, and then the key protagonist is actually Linda Hamilton, who plays the Sarah Connor character. And I really love the ways in which James Cameron brings this, almost unimaginably cheesy concept and brings a lot of seriousness to it, and he certainly does that very capably and well. He and his production team do that very well. The Terminator comes back to the year 1984 and tries to hunt down Sarah Connor, who's working as a waitress in a Big Boy restaurant, which I've always gotten a chuckle from. And the film proceeds. The other person that is sent from the future back in time to protect her, we find is this man named Kyle Reese, who we are later told was actually sent through the time portal by Sarah Connor's future son, her unborn son at this point, whose name is John. And all of these different set pieces and wavelengths and concepts are actually sometimes very difficult to balance. But you'll find if you watch the film that there is a very cohesive sense to this plot, and it works actually shockingly well. Definitely a violent film. I would say that if you have not seen it and you're not sure, I suppose it can't be a huge shocker that a film called The Terminator is going to involve death and killing. But compared to a lot of the extremely graphic films that have come out in the last 30 years or more, I don't think it would be too big of a shocker. And I do like the humanity that's brought to the forefront in this film, and the whole notion that humanity is living with this sense of detachment from any possibility of a future reality that is staggeringly different than the one they're living in. So Americans, the American citizens that populate the background of this film are living their lives as many people did in the 1980s. So with reckless materialistic abandon. And that certainly comes through as well. And that's part of this. One of the things that James Cameron does in this film is an existential framework where he's bringing these questions about, the realities that we've defined for ourselves. How legitimate are those? And in fact, how fragile might they actually be? So I would recommend it to you. Two other films for James Cameron in the 1980s that I also want you to be aware of. I'm not going to post clips of these two. I have posted a clip of The Terminator that you can actually, if you prefer to, you can pause right now and watch that clip. That's just fine. I'm not going to post clips of the other two, although they are excellent films. Aliens is from 1986, is another film that really just kind of stabilized and ensured that James Cameron was not going to be some sort of a directorial one-hit wonder. And it is a very capable sequel to Ridley Scott's original masterpiece from 1979. And it just kind of ups the ante with a lot of terror and violence when a group of colonial Marines go to the planet that has lost contact with Earth, where a bunch of colonists were kind of doing this mining operation, and all sorts of chaos ensues. So it's not just one alien, as the title suggests, but rather, a couple of hundred of aliens that are chasing down and trying to kill these Marines. And the other film that I think is worth mentioning is The Abyss, a very capable sci-fi alien sort of thriller. It reminds me of, one of the ways I think that Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel, actually, when they reviewed the film back in 1989, they both mentioned the fact that it sort of reminded them of an undersea and underwater alien epic that was sort of like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, sort of like Spielberg's film. And actually, James Cameron took a little heat for that. There did seem to be a fair amount of borrowing from basic plot lines and kind of transplanting them over. But I think some of those critiques were a little bit unfair. It has some originality all its own, and it's definitely worthy of your time. Okay, let me just move on. So a bunch of great dramas, or biopics as we sometimes call them, from the 1980s. And there are a couple I want to mention that I am not posting on, but I wanted you to be aware of them. Actually, let me just make sure. Yeah, I wanted to double check. The only one that I'm posting as a clip on the Converge site is going to be Chariots of Fire, which I'm going to come back to in a minute. But there are a number of really, astoundingly effective drama pieces from the 1980s that are definitely worth your time. And I'm not going to trace through every plot line with these other slides, but I just want to mention a couple things in passing. So I mentioned The Color Purple previously. This is Steven Spielberg's effort to deal with the ongoing realities of racism in the mid 20th century, and I think he does a fine job with that film. Ordinary People is a Robert Redford directed film, one of his first one of the first films he actually chose to direct instead of star in. Ordinary People is it's a very heavy drama, and it deals with suicide and the loss of dear loved ones, and it's definitely kind of overbearing in that sense, but it's a very well staged and well manufactured piece. Two others I want to mention. On Golden Pond, one of the last films that Henry Fonda made, and co-stars in it. His daughter Jane is in it with him, as well as Katharine Hepburn in one of her later roles, not her last role or anything, but one of her later roles. And it just shows this aging couple who are retired, living in their country house, kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and contending with their challenging daughter and her. She's an adult woman, but definitely not a very mature woman, and kind of bringing that whole family complexity to the forefront. But it's also a very delightful and endearing film as you see Katharine Hepburn and Henry Fonda, their characters interact with each other in the film, and I would recommend it to you. Amadeus and Rain Man are the other two I'm going to mention, although Driving Miss Daisy is an awful lot of fun. It's kind of a dramedy is probably the way I would put it. There are some very lighthearted and delightful engagements between Jessica Tandy and Morgan Freeman in that film. But it is actually also has some dramatic firepower is probably the way I'd put it. Amadeus and Rain Man. So Amadeus is, in my opinion, one of the great biopics. It takes some, there's definitely some dramatic license, I would say, with that film, as far as presenting the life of Mozart through the lens of one of his competitors, Salieri. And so, you can kind of if you get too wound up about that, you might not enjoy the film. They had to kind of compress some things and compress some time frames that didn't actually happen the exact same way. But I do think that for the most part, it's a pretty faithful retelling of some of the basic moments in Mozart's life. And I love the fact that there is maybe not as much from an intentional perspective, but Milos Forman, the director, populates his film with some really powerful, I think, Judeo-Christian worldview concepts. And you certainly see that Salieri, who's kind of lived this life, he's kind of this self-described devotee to faith and music, and kind of regards himself as something like the other son in the biblical parable of the prodigal son, right? The other son, it kind of holds himself up as this self-righteous individual, and you kind of get that sense from Salieri. And then you as an audience, you're watching the stunningly gifted Mozart, who is so talented, who is so beyond, almost beyond capacity to comprehend and appreciate in his brilliance. He's able to compose music as it just flows from his mind onto sheets of paper, and the glorious music that he makes is so critical to this, because you get this notion that's, I think, pretty powerful, kind of reminding us of the giftedness, the Imago Dei concept of how we are indeed image bearers of Christ. And even those who may not have lived lives of faith and commitment to the Lord have powerful gifts, and Amadeus certainly is bringing that to the forefront. Rain Man is another film you should watch as well. Just a delightful performance from Dustin Hoffman. Tom Cruise is actually very effective in the film, but I don't think his role was quite as challenging to play um, as Dustin Hoffman's. So the high functioning, well, uh, moderately functioning autistic that Hoffman plays is, it caught audiences a little bit more off guard in 1988 when the film came out. It's not a topic that had been a huge part of a cultural discussion to that point. And so I think one of the benefits of that film, beyond the pure drama of it, was that it started a lot of conversations, and I think it's definitely worth your time. Okay, Chariots of Fire is the film I wanted to mention. I want to. It's one of these films where it's so the the moral and ethical strength of the film is kind of the reason it exists. You're looking at these competitive athletes who are preparing for the 1924 Olympic Games. And the two major focal points are a Jewish man named Harold Abrahams, and the other key character is Eric Liddell, the famous missionary, who before his time in China was a world famous runner and also a rugby player. But the film by Hugh Hudson does not focus solely on the athletics themselves. It really brings into focus the era. It's just after World War I, the catastrophe of the war, the catastrophe of the flu epidemic that broke out after the war was winding down and over, killed more than 20 million people worldwide. Some say the numbers were more like 27 million people. So there's a bit of a connection to the moment we're living in right now, I suppose, in that sense. But the power of this film is really, as you look at these characters and the challenges that they contend with and that they overcome personally, the challenges in their relationships with their families and other parts of the culture. And if you're looking for a heroic Christian figure that deserves to be lionized, Eric Liddell's your guy. All of the temptations of a famous athlete, even in the 1920s, are there for this man, and he stays committed to what he knows is right. There's a famous scene in the film where he tells his sister, I believe God made me for a purpose, and that purpose is ultimately to be a missionary in China. But he tells her, he says, but I'm also fast. He also made me fast, and he says, when I run, I feel his pleasure. It's just a powerful, poignant moment in the film, and I just love the fact that this deeply Christian man, his life, his legacy, is brought to the forefront through a major studio release all the way back in 1981. It is phenomenal filmmaking. It is a great biopic. So I would recommend it to you, and there is a link that I posted on Converge for you to look at. Some comedies, boy, there are some funny ones, and I'm not going to take the time to go through all these slides, but you can see them here on the on the Zoom lecture screen. And look, a lot of funny ones. You can just read through them and see. I have some personal favorites. I would say this is Spinal Tap. I've always loved Christopher Guest and his crew. They later made films like Best in Show and Waiting for Guffman and some others. Very clever. And they built on the success of that film, which is rightly called a mockumentary. Very funny. One of the funniest moments in the film is the point where the aging rocker is, as I said, I actually talked about Rob Reiner the other day, so we've talked about Spinal Tap. So this is the Spinal Tap film we've already talked about. I'd forgotten that I mentioned it to you. So go watch that sequence. I did actually post it, I believe, on Converge. Airplane, just crazy funniness, total parody, and a lot of fun. Same with The Naked Gun. These are really fun movies. Caddyshack got a lot of attention in 1980, kind of a Rodney Dangerfield moneymaker. He and Chevy Chase and Bill Murray as the groundskeeper at this particular country club, and of course the stupid gopher that that populates the film as well. It's a funny set piece. Another one I should mention in passing, just because I'm a Chicago native and I can't help it, I suppose, is the Blues Brothers, John Landis film with the late John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd when he was actually very young and thin. uh, Two musicians getting a blues band back together after the John Belushi character, Jake Blues, has gotten out of prison, and all sorts of hijinks ensue. And they're running from the cops. They're running from these idiotic, buffoonish Illinois Nazis. It's a very clever set piece. It's funny. It also has some spectacular blues music from a lot of the great blues artists of the mid 20th century. Aretha Franklin's in there, Cab Calloway's in there. It's some really great music. So it's one I would definitely put on your watch list. Another personal favorite of mine, I know you guys probably know of A Christmas Story. Great film, a lot of fun. A lot of people watch it at Christmas, so I suspect many of you have seen that. I love it too. There's another really just outlandishly funny Chevy Chase film from the 1980s in which he plays an investigative reporter named Irvin Fletcher. Everybody calls him Fletch in the film, and it's actually one of the surprising hits of the 1980s. Many people were not really sure if what a film about this investigating reporter at a newspaper in LA, how could that possibly be engaging and funny? It really is. All the disguises that the Fletch character wears and uses to get to his source material and to figure out what's going on with this controversy about drugs on the beaches. It's actually very, very funny. John Hughes films, I already mentioned John Hughes with Ferris Bueller and Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, so I think we're pretty much set with this one. I want to move on. Some noteworthy romantic films of the 1980s. I have not spent time on too many of these, so I just want to mention a couple of these in passing. Look, the one that really stands out, actually the two that really stand out that have really stood the test of time are probably actually The Princess Bride and When Harry Met Sally, and yet I would say each of the rest of these has their own power to them, and they're actually very well done pieces as well. I would want to bring special attention or focus for just a moment on a film that both Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert in their television movie critic show focused on quite a bit, and they both thought this movie deserved a whole lot more critical attention and probably more awards than it received, and that is a film called Say Anything, a Cameron Crowe picture that with two of the rising stars, teen stars of the era, that really I think hones in on John Cusack, by the way, is the protagonist. Iona Skye plays his love interest, and they're both really wonderful in the film. So those are the two stars I'm mentioning here, and their characters are just so perfectly constructed. Not just because of the 1980s. Certainly, the 1980s set pieces are fun, and the boombox scene is very famous, and that's reminiscent of the 80s. But it has really, I think, aged well because it gets to the heart and core, the heart of teen angst and all the concerns about life as things like high school are finishing up, and the questions about what to do, as adulthood is rushing toward you, all the uncertainties regarding even the concept of a romantic, loving relationship with somebody, and all that's just brought to the forefront very well. Very in an entertaining fashion, but also in very touching fashion. And the two characters are really well done in that film. Princess Bride is a film that most of us have probably at least heard of, if not watched. I've watched that film God knows how many times because the quotes in there are just so fantastic. I just talked about that because of Rob Reiner the other day, though, so you guys don't need to hear any more about it right now. And When Harry Met Sally as well with Reiner. So he seemed to be doing an awful lot of romantic films in the 1980s. Woody Allen's film Hannah and Her Sisters is another film worthy of your time. Definitely some great performances. I think Sigourney Weaver in particular in that film is off the charts. She's really, really effective in that particular plot. So just another film I want to mention in passing. To this day, I'm not sure how or why, but An Officer and a Gentleman with a young Richard Gere and Deborah Winger got an awful lot of attention when it came out, and people were flocking to see it. So it's on here. I myself don't hold it in such high regard. I think it's a little bit canned as far as the acting and the plot lines, but a lot of audiences certainly did love it, so it at least deserves to be mentioned. So action suspense films. We've already dealt with Raiders of the Lost Ark, so we've already dealt with Indiana Jones a little bit. And I've already mentioned Witness, which is important as well. So there are some other films here that I would at least just like to say a couple things about as we're talking. The first film, just in passing, I want to mention is the first Rambo film was called First Blood. And when it came out, I believe in 1981, if I'm not mistaken, there had been a number of other actors considered for the role of John Rambo. And actually, Steve McQueen was originally offered the role, and then they kind of put the film production on hold for a while, and then McQueen contracted mesothelioma cancer and died, and they had to come up with some other options, and Stallone came into that role. And it actually had a lot of traction with audiences, probably because Vietnam was not too far in the rearview mirror at that point in our cultural history. And so the return of a Vietnam vet that is kind of on hard times and can't seem to find a job that suits him, and obviously is still struggling with what we've all come to know as PTSD, all the traumas from the war itself, and the realities of coming home to a country that ostensibly anyway didn't appreciate some of its Vietnam veterans the way that they should have been appreciated. Those are kind of in the background of this film as this special forces veteran is kind of targeted by this policeman in Washington State, and then gets himself into a heap of trouble because he reacts to that harassment violently, and then it becomes sort of a manhunt. And it actually was one of those films that surprised a lot of audiences and critics. So something to be aware of. A lot of the other Rambo movies kind of degenerated into pointless violence, in my opinion, not really as well crafted as the first one was. The Untouchables, another great, I think one of the great gangster films of that era. One of the great performances by Robert De Niro as Al Capone in the film. And Kevin Costner continued in his meteoric rise by landing the role of Elliot Ness. He also, in the same year, was in a film that's on this screen called No Way Out, which is one of the great political thrillers and action films of that decade as well. I would highly recommend that film. It's an excellent movie, but very violent, and there's some sexual content you'd have to edit here and there. But The Untouchables, certainly violent, dealing with the Capone era and bootlegging and the hunt by the Treasury officers led by Elliot Ness, the character played by Kevin Costner. But for me, one of the great roles in the film is actually brought to the forefront by none other than Sean Connery, who plays Malone in the film, this aging cop in Chicago who comes on board with Elliot Ness's team and helps him bring Capone to justice. And very violent film. I think that there is reason for that. It is very contextually brought to the forefront. You see the heinous violence of Capone and his thugs, and you see also what the Treasury Department was willing to do to try to bring Capone to trial. it's a very well done film. Top Gun, I'm not going to say a whole lot about. It's an engaging film, Tony Scott film. Director, the late Tony Scott, he committed suicide a few years back, unfortunately. But it's the game changer for Tom Cruise's career. He goes from being known for films like All the Right Moves and Risky Business and The Outsiders, right? To kind of catapulting to the forefront. He becomes an A-lister almost overnight, and it's primarily due to his role in Top Gun. Very, very straightforward plot about Navy F-14 pilots going to the tactical weapons school in Miramar, California to hone their skills. And of course, there are plenty of challenging relationships between the officers that are in the school together and are competing with each other. The love interest in the film is Kelly McGillis, and she does a very fine job. So I don't want to dismiss it, but I would say that there are some other films that have stood the test of time more effectively. And Lethal Weapon and Die Hard, I think, are films that certainly merit a lot of attention. The Richard Donner film, Lethal Weapon, was maybe initially by some dismissed as a buddy cop film, but I think that is maybe too easy of a dismissal. It was a very, very effective film, bringing together the two protagonists, the two characters. Mel Gibson and Danny Glover play these two cops, a black cop and a white cop in LA in 1987, dealing with all of the violence that is in the city on a regular basis, of course. The Mel Gibson character, Martin Riggs, is a ex-special forces guy, and he's listed on the LA cop register as a lethal weapon because of his capacity to kill. and you see that character has, as the Richard Donner production team made sure to exploit, they made sure that his character as written has plenty of opportunities to do just that. So the Martin Riggs character is a killing machine, and he has to be reined in on occasion, but they're also dealing with some pretty nasty people in the film. It's a pretty basic action adventure Hollywood fare, but it's actually a very well timed and executed piece. The film that I think stands out, other than Raiders of the Lost Ark, the film that stands out, I think, is one of the great action adventure films of the late 20th century, is definitely Die Hard, the John McTiernan film, starring, again, actually pretty young Bruce Willis, who is coming off of television stardom in a series called Moonlighting with his co-star Sybil Shepherd. And he took this role, and it just catapulted Bruce Willis again very quickly, almost overnight, to at least for a time, to the A-lister action hero status in the Hollywood film industry. But it's a very clever film, to be honest with you. I love the set piece. I love the way it's framed. The special effects are integrated beautifully, and the character of Hans Gruber, the villain in the film, is played by the late Alan Rickman. He died recently, and it's also a career maker for Rickman. And so these terrorists seizing the tower of this Japanese company based in LA, the Nakatomi Company, and this cop who's come out from New York to visit his estranged wife, who is working for this Japanese company. He kind of just stumbles upon this scenario and then ultimately becomes the key, really, for taking down these terrorist bank robbers who seized the building. It's a very, very well done film, and it will definitely keep you on the edge of your seat. So by the way, I did post the two films I did post on are what did I just see? Lethal Weapon and The Untouchables. So I posted two links on Lethal Weapon and The Untouchables. I would say that the Die Hard film definitely deserves, other than Raiders of the Lost Ark, Die Hard deserves the most attention of any. I would just recommend going ahead and making time for that entire film when you have the chance. Some war films. something to be aware of here. So there's the 1970s and then again the 1990s actually are 2 decades where the achievement of directors making high-end, really phenomenal war films, they certainly stand out. But sometimes what that means is that the films in the 1980s are dismissed out of hand. And I think that would be ridiculously unfair. And you can see here these are all excellent films. Some dealing with World War II, couple with World War I, actually one with World War I, and one with the Civil War, and the rest with World War II and Vietnam. The Oliver Stone film I've talked about already. Stanley Kubrick's film Full Metal Jacket is, man, talk about a dark film. The only film that I think is deeper and darker and more difficult to watch might actually be Apocalypse Now by Francis Ford Coppola. But it's actually a very effective film. I think it's sort of it's sort of like Full Metal Jacket has two different feels to it. The first third or more of the film is actually about these Marines being trained at Pendleton, I believe, to prepare for their roles in combat. And so their drill sergeant is taking them through their paces, and it's a pretty brutal, eye-opening sequence or part of the film to just watch through that. But it's one of Kubrick's better efforts in his later career. It's like he'd expended so much of his creative energies in the 1960s and 70s. When he gets to the late 1980s, his films are still good, but they're just not quite the masterpieces of some of his earlier works. Platoon by Oliver Stone, we've talked about previously, and I'm not going to go into too much detail on it here. I would highly recommend that to you. Das Boot is actually a foreign language film, and I'm including it here, even though I know that's usually not what we've been doing. But I would highly recommend it to you. It has a really powerful insight into the realities of life for the U-boat crews. This is particularly focused on through the U-boat crew on a German submarine during World War II, the Wolf Packs, and it's very, very well done. I would highly recommend it. Let me see here. So what did I leave out? Oh, Glory. Yeah, the film I wanted to talk about real quickly was Glory, a Civil War film about the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, which is one of the black regiments that served in the American Civil War. It is a powerful film by Edward Zwick, the director, and starring some of the great actors of the 1980s moving forward. Morgan Freeman and Denzel Washington are lights out phenomenal in this film. Morgan Freeman, I think, kind of carries the film in a very very solid, very commanding performance. And yet I would also say Denzel Washington kind of steals the show, steals a lot of scenes in the film because he's just so convincing. His character is so unbelievably convincing, and he brings that role to the forefront so well. They're both great in that film. Matthew Broderick was a strange cast as Shaw, but he's capable in the film. I wouldn't say that he's fantastic, but he's very capable in the film. And I think it's another one of those films that deserves a lot of attention. All right. So I did post a link on that one. Here we are, sci-fi. I've got to end with one or two films that I have not mentioned yet. The two that went on the 1980s already supplied their videos. They both decided that the greatest film of the decade was The Empire Strikes Back. I'm not sure that I would agree necessarily that it's the greatest, but it is undoubtedly a great sci-fi film, and it is a very, very, very good film. It's in my masterpieces of film, top 50 all-time masterpieces. So it belongs up there, right? So I personally think that even in the sci-fi genre, I would probably put Blade Runner over The Empire Strikes Back because of its innovative qualities. So I'm just going to talk about that one for a minute here. But I don't want you to think that The Empire Strikes Back is some sort of a second-rate film. It is one of the great sequels of all time, and it happens to be in the Star Wars, the Star Wars franchise. So episode 4 and episode 5, even today, they are far and away the best of all the Star Wars films. They're so well done. So something to be aware of. The Blade Runner film was a film that kind of caught audiences a little bit off guard, and many of them did not exactly know how to respond to the film at first. And it kind of had a building reputation over time. And it's based on a short, actually a novella is probably the way I would put it, a sci-fi novella by the great author Philip K. Dick. And the original title was Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And they turned it into this particular film. And it's sort of like a throwback in the sense that the Rick Deckard character played by Harrison Ford is sort of like a noir detective from the 1940s. It's very reminiscent. The Deckard character is very reminiscent of watching, say, The Maltese Falcon or The Big Sleep with Humphrey Bogart and the characters that Bogart plays in those films. But it's very futuristic. So the Deckard character has been brought forward into the 21st century. It's set in 2019 of all things. And Deckard is part of a special police unit called a Blade Runner unit. And these guys are assigned to hunt down and quote unquote retire replicants, which are androids who have kind of gone off the reservation and are no longer obeying their programming, and they need to be decommissioned, as it were. But what they really mean is they're killing them. And so this film by Ridley Scott is bringing the whole notion, the very existential notion of what it means to be human, and what are the things that define us as human beings. And are we prepared to suggest or acknowledge that the replicants in the film, maybe in some respects, given their concern for their surroundings, given their interest in preserving their lives and remaining part of the living universe, it's very interesting because there are times in the film when it almost seems like the Roy Batty character played by the late Rutger Hauer and his cohorts, his android cohorts, that they're more appreciative of their existence than many of the human beings who populate the drab planet, the drab cityscape of the future. And it's a very powerful film with a lot of really interesting questions that rise to the forefront. We've already talked about E.T. Look, Back to the Future is another fantastic film. What a powerful sci-fi, action adventure sci-fi decade it was in the 1980s. Back to the Future, just one of the things I love the most about that film, honestly, is just the initial shock that Michael J. Fox's character has when he goes back in the DeLorean. He goes back to November of 1955 to his hometown, and where his parents were high schoolers. And it's such a really brilliantly played set piece, and I love how Robert Zemeckis carries that off. The director is Robert Zemeckis for that film. And boy, we've all kind of fallen in love with those characters, right? Doc Brown and Marty McFly. These are absolutely perfectly constructed family adventure, engaging kinds of films. And boy, Back to the Future is one of the classics as well. Okay, so I did post a link to Blade Runner and also to Back to the Future. And that is it, folks. That's it for us right now. That's going to end it for the 1980s. I anticipate on Monday we'll start moving forward into the 1990s, and I'll be posting some of the student links for their 5-minute presentations on the greatest film of the 1990s at that point. But make sure that you go back and watch The other two links that I've already posted, your two classmates did a nice job. I really like their two videos, so I want you to go ahead and watch those too. Other than that, I think we're all set to go for the moment. I hope you're doing really well. I hope you're safe, and I'll continue to pray for you. I miss seeing you in class. I miss being able to interact with you guys, but we're going to make it through this. So keep pushing forward. Hope you enjoy watching this video. See you guys.